Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to this webinar related to the Gender and Youth Promotion Initiative 2021. My name is Ylva Sjöndal, and I am the coordinator of the Gender and Youth Promotion Initiative this year. This thematic webinar will focus on mental health and psychosocial well-being, and it's a pleasure to have you all join us today. Before we start, I'd like to make some small reminders and points. So firstly, the webinar is being recorded. Secondly, please keep your cameras off just to make the connection as good as possible for everyone, since we have a lot of people from different places joining us today. Questions are very welcome. Please use the chat for questions. After the presentations, we will have a Q&A session where your questions will be answered. The presentation, as well as the presentation slides, will be available on the GYPI website listed here. And the French webinar, this same webinar is taking place in French at the same time, and the link is available on the website listed here. Yes, with that, I think we're ready for presentations of the presenters. Anne, would you like to present yourself? Seems like you
hear me.
Yes, now I can hear you. Thank you so much.
Here, just quickly so you can see my face. Hello, everyone. I'm Anne Wilhoit. I'm a mental health and psychosocial support specialist with UNICEF, based in New York, but working from Pretoria, South Africa. Thank you, everyone. Nice to have you join us.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Germán, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, everyone. This is Germán Vega from UN Women, Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action section at HQ.
Lovely. Thank you so much. And Germán is doing the incredible task of joining both webinars at once. So he'll be here to present and then join the French one. Great. Shaza, would you like to introduce yourself too? Maybe there's a problem with your mic, Shaza? Okay, well, we'll fix that during the webinar and you'll hear from Shaza later. Great, thank you so much. Okay, I think we are ready to get started. So here's the overview of today's presentation. So a quick overview of GYPI 2021, as well as relevant frameworks. And then the presentation from the colleague from UN Women on the Women, Peace and Security resolutions and Mhpss. And then the presentation from our UNICEF colleague, more in depth on mental health and psychosocial support, followed by the Q&A. Great. So in terms of GYPI 2021 and the thematic focus, as I am sure you may know already, this year's GYPI will focus on promoting meaningful participation of women and youth in local peace building. And for the purpose of this call, local peace building is defined as peace building efforts focused on the community or subnational level. Proposals in two areas will be prioritized. So firstly, promotion and protection of civic spaces, notably regarding land, indigenous peoples, and environmental issues. And secondly, promotion and strengthening of mental health and psychosocial well-being for women and youth as part of local peace-building processes. And that is, of course, why we're here today to discuss this second topic. So here's a quick recap of women, peace and security frameworks and youth peace and security frameworks. These were covered more in depth in the introductory webinars, so feel free to go back to those if you would like to hear more on this. And also, it will be covered a bit more in the presentation from the colleague of from UN Women as well. But just to give a short recap, in terms of key messages from Resolution 1325 and others on women, peace and security, gender does not equate women. It's also about power relations between men and women. There are also different impacts of conflict and peace building on people of different genders, and different gender norms and behaviors can be challenged or enhanced to promote peace. And of course, women should not be viewed as passive victims without agency or potential for peace building, but instead women are indispensable allies for peace and security. In terms of key messages from the Resolution 2250 and others on youth, peace and security, deconstructing stereotypes and perceiving young men as threats and young women as victims is needed. Those stereotypes are needed to be deconstructed. It also stresses that the vast majority of young women and men are peaceful and are indispensable allies for peace and security. It further emphasizes that when investments are made to support resilience of youth and their contribution to peace building, societies may reap a peace dividend. So that was just a short recap. Okay, then I would like to hand over to Herman. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, as I was saying, I at HQ, I'm just going to present a little bit on the interlinkages between the WPS agenda and mental health and psychosocial support within the framework of the GYPI, and sort of giving you a few ideas of, you know, the types of things and considerations you may want to take into account when coming up with ideas for programming. And I promise this is not only going to be a presentation on the resolutions, but let's just go into it. Just as a little bit of background, there are 3 resolutions, WPS resolutions, that you know, sort of draw the link between the agenda and mental health. The first one, 1888 from 2009, says encourages states with the support of the international community to increase access to healthcare, psychosocial support, legal assistance, and socioeconomic reintegration services for victims of sexual violence, and in particular rural areas. 2106, it recognizes the importance of providing timely assistance to survivors of sexual violence and urges the United Nations entities and donors to provide non-discriminatory and comprehensive health services, including sexual and reproductive health, psychosocial, legal, and livelihood support. And 2467 of 2019 affirms that victims of sexual violence should have access to national relief and reparations programs, as well as healthcare, psychosocial care, safe shelter, livelihood support, and legal aid. So as you can see, like, there's a big emphasis on sexual violence and let's say mental health or psychosocial support for sexual violence survivors. But then what are those broader links between the WPS agenda and mental health and psychosocial support within the framework of GYPI, particularly in terms of programming? Next, please. So we can identify 3, or I'm going to present about 3. First one, mental health psychosocial support to prevent, mitigate, and respond to Sgbv. Second, mental health psychosocial support as a form of transitional justice for Sgbv survivors, and mental health and psychosocial support to enable Sgbv survivors to meaningfully participate in transitional justice processes and peace building as well. So I missed that over there. But before we go into like these areas in particular, maybe it would be worth going to some of the more general things you need to take into consideration when trying to come up with a program drawing on these links. Next, please. And it's that first step. It's analyze the mental health context, even before you go into anything more deeper than that. It is very important to analyze the health context. So some of the questions to consider in order to, at the end, identify those opportunities that exist to integrate mental health and psychosocial support in your programming. One of those, some of those questions are, what are the mental health challenges and vulnerabilities faced by the individuals who participate in their project? So you need to really see what's happening with your beneficiaries or your potential beneficiaries. And of course, consider the intersectional vulnerabilities of SGBV survivors who may come from different backgrounds, of course. And second, what are the mental health problems and challenges faced by participants, families, and communities? And let's bear in mind that mental health may also be a collective, especially in crisis settings, they may be collective trauma, and this needs to be addressed. Third, can the project mitigate the potential risk of further mental health trauma to participants, families, communities? And of course, this is linked to basically do no harm. And how would you do that? And do mental health challenges and vulnerabilities pose any risk to the overall project implementation? That is very important. If there are underlying mental health issues you do not take into account, that may hamper the advancement of your project. And then you can identify those opportunities that exist to integrate the mental health psychosocial support considerations to your program. Then, of course, lastly, what resources are readily available in the community to provide mental health psychosocial support? And of course, this analysis needs to be done throughout the program cycle. The mental health context, risks, opportunities, and challenges, they need to be monitored throughout. So once that's done, we can go into the more specific considerations. So next, please. First one, the mental health and psychosocial support and SGBV prevention, mitigation, and response. So, but how is this relevant? So first of all, mental health problems may be both a cause and a consequence of SGBV. It is a cause as emotional distress, common mental health disorders such as depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, severe mental health disorders such as psychosis, alcohol and substance abuse are all drivers of SGBV and violence in general. But also it can be a consequence because, as you know, victims and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence often report mental health problems as a result of a violation that they experienced. Also, because of the social stigma attached to being a survivor. Second thing to take into consideration is the women leaders, particularly young women leaders, may be highly exposed to mental health risks due to their roles. This is, within the broader framework of women being exposed to certain risks due to their leadership roles in general. So, for instance, women human rights defenders, peace builders, journalists, and politicians are often breaking societal gender norms and working long hours, resulting in personal and familial stress and possible social alienation. These needs to be addressed in your program. And of course, we live in very particular times. We're going through a pandemic, and you need to take into account that that pandemic has had an effect, socioeconomic effect, and also mental health effect on the populations you may be targeting. So that needs to be taken into account when it comes to mental health. So second, let's next, please. Mental health and psychosocial support can also be a form of transitional justice for SGBV survivors. Let's just recall that some of the forms of transitional justice are truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of no repetition. And let's concentrate on reparations. So what are the forms of reparations? They may be compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction about the process, guarantees of non-repetition. And let's focus on rehabilitation. That's where it takes us to mental health and psychosocial support. So in your program, you may also want to take into account and draw this link between providing mental health and psychosocial support as a form of transitional justice for not only survivors of sexual violence, let's say, but also the community as a whole. But remember, when it comes to transitional justice, reparations must come from the state. So mental health and psychosocial support provided by the UN is not reparations. It's still useful for sure, but it would not be we would not be able to consider that reparations. And there's just a little quote here from the SG's guidance note on reparations for CRSV, that's conflict-related sexual violence. It says, the rehabilitation is in many cases a necessary condition to repair the harm suffered by victims of sexual violence to allow them to benefit from other forms of reparation, such as compensation, restitution, and satisfaction. And in this case, of course, that mental health and psychosocial support as a reparation may also be enabling, the work of peace builders. And that takes us to the next slide. Thank you. And is the third consideration, or let's say interlinkage between these agendas, that mental health and psychosocial support may be provided to enable Sgbv survivors participation in transitional justice, but also peace building processes. And there's this other quote on the SG's guidance note on reparations for CRSV. It says, access to adequate psychological support and treatment and to health services is also required to promote free and meaningful participation of survivors in the process and to ensure that it is beneficial rather than a harmful experience. And this also applies not only to transitional justice, but also leadership in general and peace building, of course. So taking into account this mental health and psychosocial support is, of course, part of a survivor-centered approach to transitional justice. It helps remove obstacles to survivors' meaningful participation, and it reduces the risk of re-traumatization. And this is very important because this do no harm needs to be taken into account in all these processes, of course. And then within this framework, mental health and psychosocial support can be provided, of course, by government or the TG process itself, the UN, international NGOs, local civil society organizations, which is as opposed to the reparations part of it that was only by the state. And just to, well, that's some of the considerations actually. And the next slide, I'm not going to go through it, but you'll have it. There are some useful resources you can go to sort of get some ideas on how to program mental health and psychosocial support within the framework of the WPS agenda. So that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Herman, and thank you also for being so flexible with shuffling the agenda around slightly and for joining now the French webinar. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
I'm going right there. Thank you very much. Bye.
Great. Okay, then I would like to hand the floor over to Anne. Anne, the floor is yours, please.
Great, thank you. So building really on my colleagues' talks on mental health and psychosocial support, we're going to focus a little more on the mental links between mental health and peace building now. And really the link between peace building and MHPSS, mental health and psychosocial support, is not new. It's well known that violence impacts individuals and community mental health and psychosocial well-being, which can, of course, in turn create unstable societies, which can in turn impact mental health and well-being. So you can see the cycle there, which also my colleague talked about with mental health and GBV. This, however, is also particularly true for children and youth, which we've really seen at a global scale through our work at UNICEF. Over 1 billion children currently live in areas affected by conflict and high levels of violence. Violence has a devastating impact on children's mental health and well-being, both immediately and in the longer term. These impacts cut across sectors, impacting education and health and broader protection. In situations of armed conflict, vulnerabilities are exacerbated and children are exposed to an even wider range of new protection risks than before, which can hamper their ability to survive and develop. Next slide. I just wanted to take a second to zoom out and look at what the actual definition is of mental health, because I think it is particularly relevant when we're thinking about peace building. Because it's very holistic, and probably most of you are familiar with it, but when we think about it in relationship to peace building and see how really it extends beyond health. So mental health is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, and can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So it really is this holistic definition which extends beyond health, like I said, but also encapsulates what I think is the essence of a society in which there is peace. So I think it's a really good in for us to be thinking of it that way. Next slide. And so as we get closer to understanding how to work within the linkages of mental health and peace building, it's important to consider this composite term of MHPSS, mental health and psychosocial support, to promote and safeguard that crossover nature of MHPSS. So within peace building, the psychosocial part of MHPSS is to enable and facilitate recovery by helping families and communities to reduce risk factors and strengthen those protective factors. The mental health part might be more, it is more than a medical approach, and might include things such as clinical therapy, and also programs against stigmatization, supporting families of patients who are in hospitals, and of course supporting governments in developing a good mental health system. Next slide. Another thing I find useful is to think about mental health as a dimension, and I think especially useful for thinking about this in relation to peace building. So mental health, of course, is not a negative term and is not either you are or you aren't having mental health, right? It occurs along a continuum from well-being to more serious disorders and disability. So this dimensional approach to mental health balances treatment and rehabilitation and recovery with the promotion of mental health and prevention of mental disorder. So reframing mental health as an asset, which occurs along a continuum, and understanding MHPSS in this way when looking at peace building, can help us to understand the many entry points, including the importance of promotion and prevention aspects of both MHPSS and peace building. Next slide. So theoretically, when we think about peace building in MHPSS, different peace building theories address change at different levels, right? So it's understood, though, that no matter what, effective approaches for MHPSS in peace building need to support transformative change for a critical mass of individuals and interlink individual, horizontal, and vertical change. So that's around relationship with yourself, with the individual, relationships among individuals, and also within families, for example, with and between groups, different groups in society, which is considered horizontal change and social cohesion, and between people and the institutions, and state society relationships. So that's horizontal social cohesion. In peace building, it's really critical to connect that individual change to group and societal change, which is especially relevant for mental health as we think about the individual's well-being being very much connected to the stability and relationship with society. Next. So when we think about why it's so important for including MHPSS in peace building, the Dutch report on peace building and MHPSS is a really helpful lens for this. It especially noted that conflict negatively affects people's mental well-being, social cohesion, and interpersonal trust in leaders and institutions. And by failing to sufficiently acknowledge and address these psychosocial factors and dynamics, you will likely undermine the effectiveness and sustainability of any peace-building efforts. So therefore, it's important to systematically apply an MHPSS lens to sustaining peace efforts and that can contribute significantly to the effectiveness of peace building as a whole. So this should be the case not just in one or two places throughout peace building programming. It should be the case throughout the whole process of peace building interventions, from the beginning context analysis to formulation of goals, any development and planning of interventions, the implementation of interventions, M&E, and then analyzing and learning from those implementations. All aspects should include MHPSS along the way. Violent conflict has a wide scale on the individual impact, which has been noted: loss of life, physical and psychological injury. A 2019 WHO report shows that 1 in 5 people in post-conflict settings has depression, anxiety disorder, PTSD, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia. And that doesn't even include the vast spectrum of daily stressors that come from economic, political, social hardship, which also have a negative effect on people's well-being, and therefore their resilience and agency. So that's the individual level. But violent conflict also damages social cohesion and communal political infrastructure and relationships. So reconstructing society after armed conflict needs to be a multifaceted process that moves beyond addressing those individual needs and beyond addressing only institutional factors. By recognizing the importance of community-level MHPSS and addressing those challenges in their entirety, which means working at the individual level and restoring relationships at the family, community, and societal level, and also helping communities to address the wider social issues involved, doing this directly impacts the effectiveness and sustainability of peace building, as well as the longer-term violence prevention across all phases of the peace conflict continuum. Next slide. So the Dutch report that I mentioned came out with some very specific recommendations so I just wanted to take you through them because they're very relevant to what we're talking about today. So the first recommendation was about promoting the increase of knowledge. So they suggested to have some sort of hub, a global resource hub on MHPSS and peace building. The second was increasing awareness within civil society and the UN on the importance and potential of MHPSS through a whole system approach. So they suggested that this would be done through developing and providing training on MHPSS for staff and management working in conflict prevention and peace building, and also integrating MHPSS into training curriculum for peace building workers globally. The third recommendation was to integrate MHPSS into peace building policies, frameworks, and programs. So this means that MHPSS should be specifically included in country assessments, including those components relevant to peace building, in risk assessments and conflict and development analysis, and any human rights assessments. And then also through SDG national action plans, integrating MHPSS into peace building as a part of the SDG national action plans. And finally, looking at a way to process, or looking at a process to identify peace building priorities, which are being undertaken by governments and civil society. The fourth recommendation was to build partnerships and create opportunities between MHPSS and peace building practitioners in the UN and civil society at all levels, country level and globally, and community level. So this recommendation, which aptly to our conversation today, called on the Peace Building Fund to provide funding for projects and pilots that integrate MHPSS and peace building. It also called for building bridges between different professional communities, for example, by providing basic training on peace building and conflict sensitivity to MHPSS experts, or when designing peace building interventions, including existing MHPSS expertise to advise on the integration of MHPSS in analysis, strategy, programming, and M&E. Next slide. Another thing I just really wanted to mention in our conversation today was the do no harm aspect, and my colleague before also mentioned this, but I wanted to mention some specific things that have come out of guidance, and also, to be honest, directly from observations that I have seen at a global level that could potentially cause great harm. I think we need to be especially careful of this when integrating MHPSS into peace building. So at a cross-cutting level for any multidimensional peace-building program is this aspect of do no harm. So you can find more details, of course, on the IASC MHPSS guidelines from 2007 that include broadly what do no harm principles would be for MHPSS, but really important especially to think of a few things when we're thinking of peace building specifically. So I think overall, ensuring that the purpose of the MHPSS and peace building outcomes are indeed driven and embedded in the goals and desires of the community and their own understanding of well-being. So this means that external political or ideological goals would really undermine mental health, well-being, and ultimately the peace and stability of the community at large. The goals need to be coming from the community, not external pressures. Secondly, to ensure basic ethical provisions such as confidentiality and safety of the community, especially confidentiality around data is important, because particularly in sensitive political environments that are usually host to peace building efforts, it's really important that data and information are carefully guarded for a variety of personal reasons and political reasons. It needs to be guarded for those individuals. There are a lot of people interested in that information, so it's especially careful to safeguard in these settings. Third, to require that programs are quality assured, they must have proper training and supervision of the staff. And I'm talking about technical and clinical supervision overall, not just management, making sure that all of that is included in ongoing programming for MHPSS and peace building. And then any MHPSS program within peace building efforts must link to referral systems in an MHPSS system of care for any additional needs that the MHPSS that might be within the MHPSS pyramid, if you're familiar, in terms of more specific care all the way down to community care, referring up in between, and then also across sectors, that those referral pathways must be there. Any standalone programming, which I have seen a lot in peace building, that it ends up having its own MHPSS component that doesn't link to anything else. But anything like that, any standalone programming risks much further harm and isolation of those in need, as well as harming the overall systems of care. So those are some things that we must consider. And then just quickly in closing and thinking about moving forward for all of us on integrating MHPSS and peace building is that really both things, peace building and MHPSS, share that common goal to restore relationships and the social fabric that binds and supports people within their communities. And doing that as a means to end cycles of violence and building sustainable peace. Yes, sorry, it was the next slide, thanks. Although peace building is interdisciplinary, apart from exchanging referrals, a collaboration between humanitarian or development professionals and MHPSS practitioners within peace building is still relatively rare. Capacity building and regular structured interdisciplinary dialogues, especially for MHPSS affiliated professionals and field practitioners, are really recommended. So just highlighting again some of those learnings from the Dutch, but also just noting that it hasn't happened a lot before. And so this is really an opportunity for us to change the way that the MHPSS and peace building works moving forward. So we also need to just make sure that we're ensuring an enhanced understanding of the mental health and psychosocial support or psychosocial impact of violent conflict on children and communities. And to note again that MHPSS must be integrated from the very beginning of all peace building work. There can be no peace without mental health and psychosocial well-being. And finally, just to note that the scale and multidimensionality of peace building requires collective engagement by all of us. This really points to some great opportunities such for creativity, such as using technology and local customs for new approaches, or new synergies such as partnerships with community organizations, within community-based organizations globally, and also even the private sector. So peace building does require unique strategies, and new partners and old, all of us together can bring value to these programs moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your very informative presentation. Very, very useful. We appreciate it a lot. Thank you so much. Okay, so looking at some examples of programmatic responses, here are some examples of previous GYPI projects connected to MHPSS. So for example, if we look at youth promotion initiative projects, one example is a project on improving psychosocial support and mental health care for conflict-affected youth in Somalia. So this project works to improve the response to mental health and psychosocial issues affecting young Somali men and women, as well as to reduce stigma and promote community-based approaches. And the titles here are links to the website of these projects at the MPTFO Gateway website, where the project documents are available. And so when this presentation is available on the website, you'll be able to click on the titles and go to the website where the project documents are available, where you can read more. Another example is the project Alternatives to Violence, Strengthening Youth-Led Peace Building in CAR. So this project worked to improve psychosocial coping skills to enhance social cohesion and opportunities for youth at community level as an alternative to violence. Yes, so looking at gender promotion initiative projects, one example here is empowering women survivors of conflict and post-conflict related sexual and gender-based violence in Guatemala. This project worked to support survivors, particularly Indigenous women, especially focused on their rights to restorative justice, transforming reparations and comprehensive care, as well as equal participation in peace building and political decision making. And again, once this presentation is available, you'll be able to click on the titles, and then that will lead you to the website where more information is available on these projects. Hopefully that will be useful. Okay. In terms of engaging, consulting, and developing projects with women and youth, we just wanted to point out that in the webinars conducted earlier this week, focusing on civic space, these ones also included presentations on engaging and consulting and developing projects with women and youth. And you can find these webinars on the website listed here. And there you can find the slides on this, as well as the recording of these webinars. That includes this as well. Here is another list of resources that might be useful when developing your projects. This will, of course, the links will be available when this gets posted on the website. Okay, Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Shasa, is your mic working now?
Yes, it is.
Oh, lovely.
Thank you. Sorry about that earlier.
No worries. Maybe if you want to start by introducing yourself, and then I think we might also have our colleagues Henny and Marie joining us, and maybe they have something to add, and then let's have a look if there are any questions in the chat.
My name is Shaza Suleiman. I work with the Peace Building Support Office here in New York, and I'm the gender advisor. Yeah, so Marie, Henya?
Yes, hi, colleagues. My name is Henya Dakak, and I am with UNFPA, United Nations Population Fund, and have been working on mental health and psychosocial support. Actually, I was one of the people who drafted the first guidelines on mental health psychosocial support in 2007. So I'm an old person on this issue. Over.
Hello everyone, my name is Marie Doucet and I work at UN Women on gender responsive peace building. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Henny or Marie, would you have anything to add at this point? Otherwise, I'll hand over to Shasa.
I think from my side, I think what was presented is extremely important, and I think will help a lot in shaping the proposals from agencies and from colleagues. But I think one of the things that would be important, to really reflect on and think about is resilience, and mental health and psychosocial support does provide communities and people with resilience, and that's something to cope and be able to really contribute to peace. So I think one of the things that I would encourage also to think about is building the resilience of local community groups or organizations that could work, on mental health and psychosocial support as part of their community cohesion, as part of reinstituting, trust in the community and among communities. And that would be something where I think tying the mental health psychosocial support, climate change, and the issue of peace building would be very, very important. Over.
So colleagues, if there are no other comments from Marie, then I think we can start with the Q&A session. If there are any questions, if there are any things that you feel that maybe need clarification or elaboration, please feel free to write them in the message box, or I think at this stage, maybe even if you want to speak, I think that will be, yeah, you can write them in the message box. There is a question on the do no harm principles. Addressing MHPSS issues can be quite sensitive and complex. How can country teams without a background or technical expertise in this area make sure that they design the right kind of interventions? For example, not all MHPSS interventions need to be medical, but how would they know if such a referral is needed? So, yeah, any of the colleagues to take that question on?
Hi, yeah, I can have a go, and then maybe if Henya has anything to add. I think first of all, it is extremely important if you're implementing MHPSS programs to have your staff adequately trained in MHPSS. I think you're exactly right that they can be sensitive and complex, especially around referrals, and so having staff very well trained in understanding when to make referrals and what are the limits of their abilities to provide the services that they're there to provide are essential. So there are examples of these different trainings online. mhpss.net is a great option for that, but it does need to be properly resourced and supervised by expert trainers, or at least trainers with this background. I don't know, Henia, if you would have anything to add to that.
I think, the principles of do no harm is very important in terms of when you are designing programs and planning for a program, that you really bring the people with capacity and people who have the expertise to do that. Because doing like while you are designing your program, and if you have not taken into consideration the capacities and the skills that is available, and you don't really work to bring all the different capacities on board to be able to implement, whether it's referral, whether it is, like more advanced psychological support that could be needed, then you are doing harm instead of doing good for the community. And that's something that we need to make sure that we always, as a principals, we always support like this principle of doing no harm. So being most probably sometimes not being gender sensitive as a design in the design of the program, you are actually doing more harm. Not being age like also not taking age into consideration in the design of the program also could do more harm. So I think the principles of doing no harm doesn't mean, you need just medical people to do the work, but it could be that the community might need support in terms of psychological first aid. It could be about really teaching them about how to take care of their own issues without really having to go further into more intervention. And in reality, basic services, just restoring basic services would actually address the majority of any psychological distress people might do have because of the situation that they are facing. So I'm just saying from the humanitarian side, we always tell our colleagues is that in doing just the restoring of basic services, you already are addressing a lot of the needs that are like related to mental well-being and ability for people to cope. And I go back to the issue of resilience, is how do we build the resilience of the community to withstand these issues. So I don't want people to think, if you are talking about mental health and psychosocial, it's about medical only bringing medical people to do the work, but knowing when to ask for their support when it's needed, how to refer to these people would be extremely helpful. But you don't really need for a mental health psychosocial support program looking at, peace building, you would not need an immediate medical program here. Over.
Thank you very much, Hania. Moving on to the questions again, there was a question, I think I briefly missed it, about examples of background of support in Mhpss in Somalia. I'm not sure if any of the colleagues can speak specifically to Somalia if there are, please do. And then the next question.
Sorry, Shasta, just to add that in case the question was about the project I just mentioned, when the slides will be posted, the title will be a link to a website where one can read specifically about that project.
Okay, thank you for that. So you can definitely find all the information related to this project and related to specific project in Somalia in the title, in the link to our portal, our website.
Thank you.
And I think There's a question also about internal capacity. I mean, yes, I think we will expect to see that a demonstration of the capacity, or a demonstration that, for example, implementing partners will, there will be assurance that implementing partners do have that capacity, or bringing on experts on the topic on board. So yes, that will definitely be something that will be looked at.
Could I add to that, Shaza?
Yes, please.
Just to kind of exactly what you said, but also just to emphasize the nuance there, which Henya also brought up in her comments earlier, is that, the expertise would need to be in line with the type of project you were doing. So if you were doing more intensive work, you would need to have someone who is more trained and able to really train up and or hire people with that existing capacity. But as also Henya mentioned, there would be definitely there would be projects where you could be doing something that was more community-based and not as intensive, where you wouldn't necessarily need higher levels of expertise hired on. And hopefully any project would link to all those different layers. And perhaps I should have spoken about the pyramid in here, but please do look up the Mhpss pyramid if you're not familiar with it, because each layer would then have different levels of expertise and types of expertise associated with it. And your teams would need to know how to understand and refer between those levels.
Okay, thank you, Anne, for elaborating on that. And other questions? I see several questions on the linkages. So one question is on developing a project that focuses only on Mhpss and transitional justice, or a project that focuses on Mhpss and peace building, versus a project that combines all Mhpss, transitional justice, and peace building. I think there was also another one on, is it possible to design a project focusing both on GBV and Mhpss, or is it strictly on Mhpss? Any colleagues to kind of take that on in terms of bringing all these topics together, because in these projects?
I think I mean, it's always going to be depending on the context and depending on the most probably the conflict analysis or the piece like analytical pieces that you do in your assessment. So I think, and I go back to the slides that were shown earlier by colleagues, you need to do your assessment and your analysis, and you drive the program from the analysis and the context, and whether, in the country at that context, they are working on transitional justice, definitely an Mhpss and transitional justice would be the most, appropriate. If it is like there is widespread GBV and definitely survivors of GBV are not being integrated into the response in the country from the peace building component or transitional justice, I think reparation for the GBV survivors, including Mhpss, would be looked at favorably. I think it always going to be derived from your analytical pieces and your assessment of what's going on, and really focusing on what are the drivers of the conflict, or what are the drivers of not sustaining peace, and therefore, you need to address that in your program. So I would, I am like, again, this is something that all of us can think about in terms of what is the most appropriate context for your intervention in terms of whether it's going to really focus on the intersection between GBV and Mhpss and peace building, or the intersection between Mhpss and transitional justice. So these are the elements that you have to, based on your context, you have to make over.
Thank you, Hania. Another question on monitoring. What kind of monitoring strategies are to be used in such projects? Interesting question. Any answers? Any takers?
Sorry, I'm not seeing that there in the chat, but just to say that there's the it's about M&E, right?
It's basically M&E, and maybe I'm thinking monitoring strategies or what to monitor, or looking more into the kind of change and things to look at. I mean, if I want to break the question a bit, I don't know if that's what the asker meant. Feel free to correct me in the chat box if you think I misrepresented the question, but I think it's along that line.
Okay, well, I just wanted to mention, at least from the MHPSS side, I actually don't know of bigger frameworks that might integrate peace building and MHPSS. I don't think there are any, but from the MHPSS side, there's the common M&E framework, which you can find, which would be a great resource to look at for at least M&E indicators from the MHPSS side, which then you would be able to tie to broader peace building indicators and outcomes.
Okay. Thank you. If there are any more questions, please write them in the chat box and we'll answer them. Link to the M&E that we just asked. Of course, we should have a minimum of 5 to 7, I think, going to monitoring and evaluation in the budget. I think, again, it's a very good resource to look at the introductory webinar we've done and look at some of the resources that were mentioned in this presentation. As a resource and to help in answering some of the questions that are coming up in the chat box. How are we doing on time, Ylva?
I think we're doing very well. And there was a question right above that also about for a project duration of 18 months, what are the MHPSS outcome indicators that PBF would anticipate? And I could start by answering that question by saying that some examples of indicators can be found in the project documents of the projects we mentioned earlier. So I think that would be a good place to start for some examples of MHPSS outcome indicators. If any colleagues has anything to add there, please feel free.
And I mean, I think I mean, in terms of what could be considered like the monitoring and evaluation component is like how much we have influenced changing any policies or capacities, or what we could have done in terms of from the project implementation, in terms of changing certain norms, if there is ability to change even among a smaller group, I mean, of people, that would be something that would really be looked favorably about. It's not like you are going to do MHPSS and you are going to really look at the individual level. You need to really think about this is, again, because it is not only at the individual level, it's the individual and the more of the community level and subnational, whatever level that you are going to work on. So it could be you need to focus on building the capacity of civic society on MHPSS in terms of their work related to improving civic society organizations in the country, to really encompass more peace and sustaining peace efforts. So most probably, you really need to do that, analysis and think about what would be important, not only from the individual level, but what is important from more of a community level and subnational level. Over.
And I just really want to support that, what Henya just said, and hopefully that was one of the more salient points of my presentation, that it really is that individual to community level linkages that need to be emphasized. And just to note that the MHPSS reference group also has a guidance note on community-based programming that really focuses on pulling from the community-based goals and ways of working, and so you can use that for reference as well.
Thank you again, Anne and Hania. Any more questions, colleagues? I think we can take advantage of having this group of experts with us to ask any other questions that you have. Okay, Yelva, are there any things you wanted to highlight also from the questions?
No, I've been trying, when it comes to questions that has more to do with process or eligibility and so on, I've been trying to answer directly in the chat. Maybe just to reiterate that this recording and the presentation slides will be available on the website, hopefully by the end of today. So, or otherwise early tomorrow morning. So yes, this will be available. But no, I don't, apart from that, I don't think I have anything to add from my side. Thank you.
Okay.
I think it's also important to really look at the empowerment component. Like I said, the resilience component, the empowerment components would be really very important in terms of working on MHPSS and the intersection of MHPSS and peace building or transitional justice at the community level. Over.
Great, thank you so much. We also received now a question about the target groups for peace building intervention. Can you briefly talk about the target groups for the peace building intervention? Would any of the colleagues like to expand a bit upon target groups for these kinds of projects?
And I think we already, the target group for this type of intervention definitely would be most probably youth-led organization, women-led organizations. At the moment, looking at survivors of gender-based violence. All of these would be target groups for this project. So civil society organization in general. So I don't think, and within the community, you can also look at different components. So it could be you are working with the security sector, or you are working with the transitional justice organizations. I think all of that, the sectionality would be very important. So it will be important to really look at the civil space, the civic space in general, and then see what elements would be needed in terms of looking at MHPSS. Of course, with the conflict analysis, you could really look which communities are more affected by the conflict and maybe target that to these communities. And again, it will always depend on the context and where you are working and the conflict analysis that you have conducted. Over.
Thank you, Hania. There's a question about having dedicated GBV outcomes and outputs. In the project, you mean? I'm not sure I'm clear about the question. And I would assume, if I take a shot in the dark, it's again linked to how the analysis and what the issues are to be that was presented in the project that would then determine outputs and the outcomes and the focus and what it will focus on, as long as the peace building linkage is clear. Any colleagues would like to respond to that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Sorry, this is
basically report is having dedicated GBV outputs, and in the project, my understanding would be, again, depending on the analysis of what we've just, what the problem and the analysis and what the issues to be addressed are, but also with the understanding that it has to have a clear linkage to the peace building issue we're addressing. But
definitely.
Maybe, Shaza, if I may add on this last point, just to remind to everyone that this is a gender and youth promotion initiative, and therefore either project submitted under the youth promotion initiative or gender promotion initiative needs to have at least a gender marker too. So in any case, whatever the focus is, you will still have to have a very strong gender component. So Sgbv is not necessarily the main gender focus or entry point that you will choose, but it could be one of the different considerations that you may want to look at.
And thank you for reminding or bringing this up, Marie. And please also look at our gender marker guidance for both the GPI and YPI. To kind of look at what we expect in terms of gender mainstreaming and responsiveness in the project proposal and in the submitted proposal. And I think it's safe to say that we've, it's, as Marie said, that's not the only focus. I'm trying to, I think I'm having problems seeing the latest questions. Are there other questions, Ylva?
I can see two. So one is about whether it's possible to focus both on civic space and Mhpss, so both of the priority areas. And just to reiterate that we strongly recommend to focus on one area and do a deep conflict analysis and really focus on that area, especially considering that these projects are fairly short in time. So in order to, be able to realistically accomplish the project, we focus on that. And then there was a question at the very end now. Do you normally recommend baseline studies and endline studies for such Mhpss programs?
Yeah, on that one, I'd say yes. For any M&E of Mhpss, it's good to have an initial assessment to figure out what the needs are and where the programs are at, and then measure as you go and respond to it as you go and adapt and change, and then figure out what your end outcomes are. And a lot of that can also be, more information anyway on that can also be found in the M&E Commons framework.
Great, thank you so much for that. Great, then I think we've answered all the questions that are there, unless there are some more questions that will come. But as far as I can see, I think we've answered all of them now. Is there anything colleagues would like to add at this point?
I'm just, Ylva, if I'm just like to remind everyone to go back also to the civic space presentation on the the points on engaging youth and gender. I think we elaborated more on those there, so please refer to those. Yeah, engaging youth and women groups. So please don't forget to kind of also reference and look at that again.
Absolutely, thank you so much. Henia or Anne or Marie, do you have anything to add or any final things to add?
Not on my side, thank you, Ylva.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Then I would like to thank all the colleagues that presented and were here to answer questions, and thank you to all the participants for joining us today. Good luck with the development of your projects, and we look forward to seeing all the exciting ideas. Many thanks, and wish you a good rest of the day.
Thank you.